Council, which I chair, is sort of the general governing body for the ShareVDE project. And our role is heavily involved with communication amongst the project members, communication with our sister projects that I mentioned earlier in the Share family, and also external communications. And one of the ways that we have this, we structure this communication is by having liaisons from all of the working groups, but also from our sister projects join us on our regular meetings, and also use these meetings as a communication tool with developers and monitoring the development timeline. The 4 subcommittees, which you'll hear from later in this presentation, are the SEI working group, or the Sapientia Entity Identification working group, the Authority-Identifier Management Services working group, or AMES, the Cluster Knowledge Base Editor working group, and the User Experience User Interface working group. And you'll be hearing from them later in the presentation. So just to go over some of the recent achievements of the working groups and the ShareVDE project. The design of the J.Cricket Cluster Knowledge Base Editor, we'll hear more about that tool later in the presentation. Analysis of authority services, and an initial release of authority control features currently being tested at Stanford. Some analysis on integrations with Wikidata and ISNI, and then a major revision of the entity model by the SEI working group. A few other things not on the slide that I wanted to mention was the PCC linked open data pool, which is part of the LD for P3 grant, and ShareVDE has set up a separate tenant for this PCC data pool, and had converted the entire PCC data set from OCLC to create linked data at PCC quality level. And additionally, there's work on integrating with Sinopia and questioning authority as part of the LD for P3 project, and this is developing an API pipeline. So what's next? And this is more of what you'll hear about. So for the rest of 2021, on our roadmap, we have work on the continued work on the discovery interface and the search APIs, the refactoring of the cluster knowledge base with the new revised scope by SEI, the J.Cricket editor release, testing of authority services beyond the current testing that's happening, and ongoing updates of the PCC data pool, and work on the interactions with LD for P3. So a lot of work is going on from a lot of different directions. So at this point, we're going to turn it over to the various working groups. I'm going to start with Jim Hahn and SEI.
Okay, thank you, Beth. I'm Jim. I'm the head of metadata research. Within ShareVDE, I'm co-chair of our SEI working group, Sapientia Entity Identification working group, and I won't read this to you, and I'll try to keep it kind of brief and sort of an overview to just stimulate discussion later, because we do want to engage everyone in a conversation here about the ShareVDE work. One of the key things that we do in the SEI group, besides sort of defining how our entities are scoped, we've reviewed a lot of the Mark 21 to BIBFRAME and BIBFRAME to Mark conversion in terms of like how these describe, say, an instance entity, and how we want to display that as well. We have works on clustering as in addition, how these entities will cluster. So kind of just to kind of round out what we've done really this past year and quarter is really elaborate on the work in Opus entities, which I'll show you a diagram in the next slide. But we've worked on more of the conversion specifications for an instance entity. A lot of work has gone into that. And then, we are iterating towards interoperability. And so we The next slide will kind of demonstrate this a little bit better, but we really want to at least reference the models that sort of inform the design of contemporary linked data systems, and LRM is a big one. We also reference RDA and BIBFRAME. So in this next slide, please, you'll see, if you take a look, start at the right, we have this highest level of abstraction, our Opus. That is a type of BIB framework. And so the ShareVDE Opus sort of maps more or less to the BIBFRAME work. And then we have a ShareVDE work that we define, and we also map that as sort of having near equivalence to BIBFRAME work. And then the rest of this should look fairly familiar if you've looked at the BIBFRAME 2.0 model. We have work, instance, and item, and this is fairly strongly aligned with what the BIBFRAME model is. So this shouldn't seem all that different. If moving over to the left, you'll see some of the data points that feed into identification of various instance entities through the use of agent clustering and publisher clustering. Next slide, please. Okay, and then to kind of give a little bit more detail, kind of mentioned this already, but we have this idea that our ShareVDE Opus, this highest level of abstraction, is a type of BIB framework. Now, we're getting more, closer and closer to defining this, and more recently we've discussed, how this is similar or dissimilar to the Library of Congress Hub. That's a little tricky to define in the sense that both of these are sort of abstractions, but what I will say is that it provides sort of clustering features for bringing mostly all the works under a canonical type. So it provides a grouping function, basically, and it's not all that dissimilar from the hub in that regard. And also the hub similarly can map to a BIBFRAME entity as well. So we've worked on defining these properties within the Opus, and basically making sure that we can provide this clustering functionality. Next slide, please. So rather than showing all the properties that might make up a work description, what I'd like to do with my last slide here is just talk about RDF editors. Now, a lot of Sapientia Entity Identification work, or SEI, a lot of the work that we've done, that's a conversion and clustering process. Now, as linked data projects mature, and I think we are in that sort of maturing phase, we're going to see more and more of linked data created natively. So this is the PCC BIBFRAME work template, and we aspire for these, for our ShareVDE works to be compatible and have correspondences with the BIBFRAME work properties that are defined for this work template. So furthermore, for those of you who are familiar with Sinopia, there are hooks here, if lower down on this page, though it's not included in this image, and I can post this to Slack later, is there's space to include a reference to a super work, or our Opus, or you could even reference a hub. Those are emergent, those are kind of new, so I don't know that it's an expectation that you would do that, but what several of my colleagues will talk about here are various tools that might help facilitate that. But I will end there and pass along to Ian, who will bring us up to date on instance work.
Okay, thanks for that, Jim. Yeah, so my name's Ian Bigelow. I'm the head of cataloging strategies at the University of Alberta Library, and I'm also the other co-chair for the SEI working group. So I'm taking over the next section for that. So in advance of the ShareVDE 2.0 versioning and the CKB refresh with the updated data model, the work of SEI working group has also focused on the instance entity and defining properties that support clustering of related instances. So in this example, we see the instance as related to the Opus and the work, but also bringing together item descriptions. As many will be well aware, variation in description often happens at the institutional level for the instance. And ShareVDE is a shared catalog with many different libraries representing numerous different instance descriptions. So here, as in any shared usage of, well, library data in general, but BIBFRAME data in specific, it becomes crucial to be able to cluster these multiple descriptions of the same instance, represent them with one entity. Of course, with many different use cases ranging from resource sharing, acquisitions, and of course, user experience, minimizing duplication and searching and so forth. Next slide, please. Okay. So here we see the model outlined for the instance entity with relationships to other key classes, agent, work, item, other related instances, and so forth. And of course, associated properties. So for the instance, as with the Opus and the work, it's been important as our group has worked through a lot of this to distinguish what properties are associated with the instance, thinking about sort of the conversion from ARC to BibFrame, but also which ones are key for search and display. So thinking about the ShareVDE portal and critically for clusterization. So those elements that are key for pulling together and creating these entities and minting URIs. Next slide, please. So we wanted to provide an example from our Stardog triple store, but apologies, I think I've got the wrong example here. I'm not sure how this snuck in. Wrong Stardog. So next slide, please. Yeah, so to tie some of this together, we wanted to give an example from the ShareVDE production Stardog triple store to highlight the different data structure from what we're used to in working with MARC data. This particular example is looking at some of the different connections of some of the live data from the Stardog triple store between the Opus and work level elements. And really just wanted to show this to highlight that the work on the different data models on the group really needs to be directly applied on real world data at a very large scale. With the different participating institutions, we've got something, I think of the order of 24 billion quads of data last time we checked. So it's really fascinating to see the data model applied at that scale of things. It's also really incredible to work with this data, a graph of bibliographic entities clearly connected with relationships, and be able to truly leverage the value of cataloging standards that have been in development for so long. Next slide, please. So finally, with the need for many libraries to work together within ShareVDE and beyond, there's also been this focus within SCI working group on interoperability. So the work of our group and the ShareVDE family more widely has been a key test of the ability of the different models that are captured here to work hand in hand. Of course, with the use of BibFrame, ShareVDE is a BibFrame data store, but with many institutions, for instance, eager to implement RDA, the new RDA, and so forth. Next slide, please. And so the final ShareVDE data model, or at least, of course, things always change and iterate, but for ShareVDE 2.0, this iteration of it with the introduction of the Opus really becomes a bridge between these two different or highly interrelated different worlds, and represents one of the main characteristics of ShareVDE to be compliant with these different visions. Just as a side note, in relation to this, we're very much looking forward to the upcoming PCC BibFrame data exchange meetings later in, I think it's September, particularly with PCC BibFrame data living and residing in ShareVDE. And thanks for that. I'll pass things over to Erik.
All right. Hi, my name is Erik Radio. I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I chair the Authority-Identifier Management Services Working Group, or AMES. So to give you a little bit of background about what this group does, is it's really focused on defining guidelines and best practices for authority and identifier management services and linked data environments. We define scope and data flow for the creation and implementation of automated services based on use cases defined by the group as we explore different data sources that we want to integrate into ShareVDE. We also propose additional use cases identified as essential for effective knowledge-based management. And to that end, we work closely with the cluster knowledge base group, which Martin will talk about shortly. This group contains members from several different types of libraries across Europe and North America. In addition to these focuses, we also kind of think of the space as a knowledge sharing space for innovative approaches to authority workflows at each institution. Since we represent many different institutions, there's many different approaches to how we do this. And so we use this to kind of reflect on what future authority services could look like based on what works well and maybe what works to what needs to be adjusted. So next slide, please. So a huge component of this group has to do with integration. So while we're very focused on working towards or on traditional authority services such as MARC authority workflows, we also realize that in the linked data ecosystem, there's more data sources available to us. And so we work closely to identify what those data sources that we perhaps want to incorporate into Share-VDE, and then through that they can get funneled into the J.Cricket editor and then into the cluster knowledge base. Next slide, please. And so, as Beth mentioned earlier, there's two main integrations that have been addressed so far. The first one is ISNI. So we developed use cases for ISNI workflows in terms of how that work within the J.Cricket editor and when ISNIs could get minted, or where we want to pull in those ISNI identifiers into the cluster knowledge base. And from those use cases, we also we replicated that for a high-level analysis of integrating Wikidata into Share-VDE. I know that Wikidata is of a lot of interest to linked data practitioners, and so we're very intent on focusing on getting that integration underway as more analysis is done on that. Next slide, please. And so our current and future work is we developed a MARC authority workflow a while ago, and that workflow has now been established and in a testing phase at Stanford. And so AMES members are currently undertaking review of that service and that workflow to provide feedback or for enhancements or changes to make that MARC authority service workflow even better. And then we're also looking again at additional integrations with other sources of authority data. And a few of us are also on the LD4 change management for authoritative data working group. And then kind of the next big project for us to tackle is the development of a BIBFRAME authority workflow. It's not going to happen overnight, so stay tuned for additional updates on that as the year goes on. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, although maybe good morning for some. I am Martin Knott, the metadata and linked data strategist at the University of Michigan. I am also the chair of the cluster knowledge base editor working group for Share-VDE. The cluster knowledge base is sort of key to maintaining the relationships of all the entities that we've talked about, the agent clusters, the instances, which are the most recently developed, the opuses and works, and making sure that all those relationships are maintained as new data is added, and also data being updated through the batch process that exists for Share-VDE, and building Sapientia. But one of the things that was very clear about this process is that there would be a necessity at some point for manual review and manual update and maintenance of the cluster knowledge base. So J.Cricket was proposed as the interface for doing this. And that process began by first defining possible use cases for the editor, and then the working group was formed. And next slide, please. And our initial goals were to look at those possible use cases and try to define workflows for how that process of updating would actually work. And what we focused on at that point as the heart of the work were either replacing the entities with something entirely new that corrected the information that the batch process had created, or merging entities. And as we worked at it, we came to the conclusion that that was the most likely workflow we would see, where there might be two or more entities represented in the knowledge base, and how to bring those together. We then tried to come up with ideas of what that interface could potentially, how it would function, what it would look like. And we tried to add into that process the things that we thought metadata managers from various institutions would potentially bring to this process, to that workflow, and how that could be added to or reflected in the interface. Next slide, please. So in doing this work, we had two major collaborations. The first was working with Phillip Jacobson, who will speak right after me, to actually sketch interface designs for J.Cricket. Phillip was already leading the work on developing the ShareVDE user interface, end user interface. So he had a great deal of knowledge about how users interact with information. And so he looked to the members of the working group as experts on how metadata managers and metadata workers manipulate data and want to interact with data. So he guided us with a steady and careful hand in shaping what we developed, and trying to think of some fairly complex ways that workflow for merging and replacing entities might occur. And with his guidance, we were able to propose fairly complex, not just interface, but workflow management for sharing work within an institution, or possibly across institutions when the need for updates were identified. And our group paused for a moment, and we asked at that point, since we wanted to wait for more feedback from developers, what else could we potentially do? And one of the things that was identified was a need to collaborate with the AMES group, because there was so much crossover in the work that we were doing and in authority and identity management. So we then collaborated with that group and focused on integration of other data sources, as Erik talked about with ISNI and Wikidata. And we spent a few months looking at that process and making modifications to the proposed interface to add in those integrations. And next slide, please. And here's an example, just one of the many pieces of the interface that Phillip was able to create from our feedback on ways that identities could be, or is it entities, could be managed, and being able to bring in the URIs from other data sets, giving us potentially a single interface for managing a complex web of the pieces of entities within our respective catalogs, but more importantly, within the shared linked data space. And next, hand it off to Phillip.
Thank you, Martin. Hi, my name is Phillip Jacobson. I am the CEO and founder of a design company in Denmark called Samhæng, and I'm also the chair of the UX UI group in ShareVDE. I'm going to talk a little bit about the user experience that we've been working on for ShareVDE, because everyone, of course, is excited about linked data and what we can do with it. But what can we do with it? What does it actually look like? And so what we've been very focused on when we've been working with subject matter experts to create a user interface for this has been, how do we make it easy to understand all of this complex data? How do we make it easy to navigate it? And how do we make it easy to act on it as a patron, or in some cases as a curator as well? And so what you'll find in the design is different ways of searching, different aids for navigating around the system, like a breadcrumb on some pages. And that doesn't represent an actual data structure, because of course all of these data entities exist in a grid, but rather represent a conceptual kind of navigation. So if you see here on the second screenshot shown, you'll see it says William Shakespeare, Hamlet, second quarto. And of course, that breadcrumb, for example, could have been built up by a number of different entities. And this, we've chosen to say that when you're looking at an instance, also show its superwork and also show the agent of that superwork, because conceptually that just makes a lot of sense. So we've worked a lot with that sort of information, and then we've worked a lot with trying to make this data useful. So what can you do with linked data? Well, one of the things you can probably do, that we're hoping to do, is link it up with a bunch of online versions of books, for example, or other kinds of content. And so when you find a piece of content on any level, so that might be, like we're seeing here, a specific version of a specific work, but it might also be just the work itself, so Hamlet, and we might have 100 versions of that. But wherever you are in the system, we want to make it easy to get to a copy of that thing. So if you were to look at the page for Hamlet itself, there would also be a link saying read online now and get a copy, because some people will care if, you know, in academia, what version are you looking at? But if you're an undergrad or you're a visitor to a library, you might not care so much about the specific versions. So that's the kind of things we've been focused on for the patrons and researchers who will be using the system. And on the next slide, we have another screenshot. And so this is a rougher version of the same kind of screen. So we're looking at an agent, in this case, a person, William Golding. And we can see all of the super opuses that have been created by this person. So these are the super works, the level above the works. And we see that this person has created Lord of the Flies and some other things. And if the people who are managing this data, like it was mentioned previously in the presentation, need to, for example, merge two of these works by this person, they can simply, if they're authenticated and logged in, they can simply select these in the list and say merge these together. And so we're breaking a bit away from a pattern that's traditionally been in the library space, which is you have one ILS for curating the data, and you have a discovery layer for the patrons to explore the data. And what we're doing is we're building everything on top of the discovery experience, both because we want to give power to the users to do advanced searches if they want, but also because we want to make it easy for even the librarians and library staff who will be using the system to do the simple kinds of searches that users will be doing, because oftentimes you just need a fast way to get to a known item. When we made this decision, it was based on the fact that the majority of the work when doing data management is actually finding the things that you need. And we'd already built a very complex, powerful search engine for end users. And so we didn't want to duplicate all of that code and have to maintain two experiences and have everyone be confused why you get different search experiences. So that's the sort of curation or management perspective of ShareVDE. And on the next slide, we see an example of the kind of curation that you can do. And so the thing that's called J.Cricket here, so the part that lets you manage the data, is not meant to do what other cataloging engines for BIBFRAME are doing. So it's not meant to do what Sinopia is doing. It's not meant to do what the BIBFRAME editor from Library of Congress is doing. It's meant to manage the clusters of data, so that these clusters of records. So if we have 5 descriptions coming in from 5 libraries of William Shakespeare, those will all go into one cluster called William Shakespeare. then you can decide, well, this William Shakespeare is actually not part of this cluster. But the features that we're building are not primarily meant at creating new descriptions of books on a very low level. It's very much, it's focused on this cluster management. So there's an important distinction between cataloging and cluster management. The line is blurry sometimes because, of course, some metadata will be editable for the clusters, but in general, it's the cluster editing versus the bibliographic record editing and authority record editing. That distinction is quite important. So on the next slide, yeah, we touch again on this concept of integrating the system with external systems like Wikidata. And the general concept is what you see here, that when you click edit for this person, you can connect this person to external sources. And if the system can automatically detect that there is a likely candidate for a match on some of the sources, it will show a little box saying, would you like to connect this this agent in ShareVDE to this external ID, and that can be on different platforms. To begin with, we're working on Wikidata. And on the next slide, we see some of the stuff that Martin was talking about. So some screenshots from snapshots, I guess, from the process. So the way that we've built this interface is not getting some bullet points from users and then going away and coming back with a finished interface. We've actually been sketching out the interface with the subject matter experts and these working groups live on the screen. And then people have been commenting saying, well, in our institution, this sort of thing could happen, or, you know, with this kind of use case, when you have two books published in one volume, you would have two opuses in one. How do we handle that? And all these edge cases and different examples. And by doing that, we've created an interface that hopefully should manage to support all of these different workflows and make it intuitive for the people who have to use this to navigate around it, because it's been designed directly with the people who will need to use it. And on the next slide, we have an example of what ends up happening with all of this data. So of course, we'll have the general ShareVDE platform, but we'll also have different versions of that. So we'll have a few branded versions, like a University of Pennsylvania catalog, and that will show all the ShareVDE data, but with a few extra filters, like the ability to toggle a switch that means that you only see stuff that's held at Penn libraries. So if you're using, so that enables you to get the power of a shared catalog and searching across a shared catalog, but also being able to use it as a local discovery experience. Yeah, the branding and colors and stuff changes a little bit from instance to instance of this platform. But overall, the idea is that, you know, we're putting a lot of effort into each of these, and whenever we build something new, it benefits all of the other versions of the system. So we just have one code base generating all of these different versions of the system. So that's so that it's manageable and a solid foundation for evolution in the future. I think that concludes my slides. So I'm not sure who's taking over from here.
Well, thanks, everybody. I just wanted to put up a few resources that are available if you want to explore more about ShareVDE. And when we share these slides, these are live links that you can use. And now I think we're going to open the floor for questions. So Peggy, have you been tracking questions from the floor, or should we go into chat?
Yeah, there were a couple in the Q&A, but they've been answered. I don't know if people want to talk, if the people who answered them want to talk about them or anything, but in terms of attendees, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A option or in the chat directly if you would rather do that.
So while people are thinking of great questions, I can add a comment to the question asked regarding what happens when you're managing Wikidata data through ShareVDE. You know, will you be able to, for example, create a new entity and have that show up on Wikidata? And the idea is that, yes, whenever you add an identifier, we want the data to flow both ways so that you can make a quick edit while you're creating stuff in ShareVDE, and that would show up on Wikidata. And still having that entity be connected to Wikidata so that we can, at whatever interval, pull out the data and show it or do it live. We're working right now to figure out how we want to do that. But
Jim, do you want to say more about the Stardog clustering that you answered on the Q&A?
Yeah, sure. I think it was about this time last year, we were doing some pretty intensive modeling and based on some of the quads or just triples that we were getting back from ShareVDE staff. We one of the techniques we do to analyze them is load them into like our local Stardog database, and you can just run that locally on your laptop through a Docker container. We load up those triples and then use Stardog's built-in visualization feature. So I was curious to see the relationships visualized, and this was around the time that we were kind of working out or just making explicit some of the relationships, so things that we had said would be there, and some of the visualizations confirmed, and so it was another way to look at the data. And it is kind of you need some sort of analytical toolkit to understand this, and if you just get a bunch of files, it's really tricky. And so even with files, like I try to find ways that make it easier to understand like what I'm looking at. And so this tells me that for these links, it tells me what that we're addressing. I would say, I want to say solving a problem, solving the problem, but I would say it provides evidence that we're headed in the right direction. I don't know that we, solved is too strong a word, and I never like going to presentations where people present things as a solved problem. So I would say this lets us know we're addressing it in the way that we think we are. And I'm sure there are, I'll let Ian weigh in because I'm sure there are like gotchas down the road that maybe that PCC meeting that's happening in September will help us understand better.
Looks like there's a question from Anna. So that I'm not sure if you prepared, but if time allows, would it make sense to quickly show the demo user interface?
yeah, I can try to show something. Do you see my screen? All right, so this is the development platform. So there's a good likelihood it's all going to crash while I'm showing it. Yeah, what you see on the front page of the platform is this code instruction about what is this for and what sort of thing can you search. And then, yeah, you can search for Tolkien, for example. So right now in the database we're using for this testing platform, we have, I think it's 700 entities. And of course, it's going to be tens of millions of entities. But right now it's a very limited amount. So as I click on, for example, Tolkien here, you don't see a lot of stuff. But yeah, what you see here is we have Tolkien and some information about him. And then I can click on to one of his super works here, The Lord of the Rings, and see different versions of that. So in this case, we have one in Italian, one in English, and two in Italian, published in different years. If I want more data, there is more data I can turn on. So we can see what happens if I try to turn all of this data on. Yeah, in this case, there aren't any notes, but sometimes you have notes for each thing. And then of course we can see that, well, this copy here is actually something that was illustrated by this illustrator, or by this person, Alan Lee, as illustrator, because Alan Lee could have written books of his own or been a singer or done other things. So if I click on this person, right now you see a very sort of minimal amount of data, because the whole experience has been very based on using linked data, meaning we want to show a little snippet from Wikipedia, we want to show some data from Wikidata, we want to pull in a picture from Wikimedia, and we're building that right now. So it looks kind of very simple right now. As soon as we get those things in here, it's going to really change the sense of moving around the system and how meaningful each page is. But right now I can move around. I think I can move down to the item level. Let's see if that crashes the system. Yeah, that doesn't work. So you can't view items right now. Like I said, it's a development thing. So if I go to Penn's version, for example, you'll see that, you know, we have a little bit of different branding, but when I search for something, then, well, actually, I think we didn't deploy this one. So let me take another one. Yeah, so here I'm on this sister project that that was mentioned. That is a German or European, sorry, art library consortium. And here we have some different data, but as you can see, the application is very much the same. So it's the same for Penn and for ShareVDE and so on. And like I said, that means that when we develop a little extra nice thing for one of these, then it benefits all of the other ones. So that's pretty nice. And I guess I should just show that you can jump from this simple search where you just type in a word to an advanced search where you can specify exactly what you're looking for. Like, I want to see people who were born between 1900 and 1950. And that should give us, yes, a long list of people and where they were born and whatever metadata we have. And then I can say, well, I only want to see the ones born in New York City. And then apparently we have 2. Again, remember, this is out of 700, so there would be more with the real data. And the really interesting thing about this is that what we're going to be developing is a list that will show up alongside these to show us all of the works by all of these people who match my criteria. So I can do a sort of 2-degree searching where I find all of these people and then view all of the works created by all of these people in one list. Or all of the works written about all the people who were born in New York between 1900 and 1950 and so on. So it's, yeah. So that's a short demo, I guess, of the platform.
Thanks, Philip. I see we have some questions from Ingrid Chigi and the Q&A. The first one is about the CKB editor. Martin, I think that's for you. Is it in operation or still in development? And I believe the first release will be this fall, but do you have plans for testing?
We haven't received any additional feedback from the development team, but there were no plans for any initial testing that have been in discussion. But because of the model that's been followed with the Authority Identity Management System, I would anticipate some form of testing before it's rolled out and as a production level service.
The second question is about whether we plan to integrate BIBFRAME records from the Library of Congress and other sources to enrich the content. And I'll start that, but I think other people can add to it. And that is that the Library of Congress is a member of ShareVDE. And so we have included their records in the clustering. I don't know the part about whether we are including them as BIBFRAME records or are they clustered starting at MARC? Does anybody know the answer to that? we'll have to get that answer and make sure it's answered offline. And then the third is, can clustering decisions be customized locally?
I'm thinking about that one because I'm trying to remember. I know one of the things we talked about was local management of the workflow, being able to potentially assign further review of an entity cluster within your institution, or having the option to have it reviewed by someone at another institution, any Share-VDE member who it was, I think we were talking level 2 full membership. But we didn't discuss the ability to customize the any descriptions or values associated with that URI with just your individual institution. I imagine that's something that could potentially be done, but it isn't something that we actually discussed during our use case discussions.
What I can mention in that regard is we have certain things that can be customized per portal. So when you go, for example, you folks can see my screen, right? When you go and see a list of something here, you'll notice that certain things are shown by default. So in this case, when you're searching for agent, you see name, type, starter, end year. And each portal, so the CubiCat and the UPen and all these different versions of the system have a settings pane or settings page where they can go and say, well, for our version of this, of ShareVDE in this case, we don't want to see start and end year because maybe that doesn't make sense for that institution, or we want to see things in a different order and so on. So there are some things that can be changed, but this doesn't actually affect how the data is clustered. So yeah, peripherally related to the question. Just wanted to mention that.
Another question, oh, that one's been answered. So unless you wanted to comment on their answer, sorry, Martin.
I just wanted to send a quick answer to Ingrid's question regarding external sources and how do we decide which ones to use. And the initial process, we wanted to focus on those that are most widely used and trusted, and possibly most importantly, actually have the APIs available to allow J.Cricket to interact with that data set.
I was just going to also sort of add, just looping back to, I think, Ingrid's question, the second part about LC and BIBFRAME records and how that's to be incorporated. I think as the others have said, I think we need to sort of follow up on that in terms of LC's plans for the BIBFRAME data set and how that would interact with ShareVDE. But until more recently, much of the work on SEI on the conversion processes, entity identification, and clustering has focused on the MARC to BIBFRAME workflow. Of course, so in terms of determining which fields and subfields create which different work and opus types, etc., to create these different entities. So, but of course, more recently, where it becomes really fascinating is, as more work is done on original BIBFRAME description. Of course, LC is one of those examples. You need to think about how clusters and how these descriptions go into ShareVDE as well. So I think this is one of the things that's currently happening. I think it was Beth that mentioned the API connections between Sinopia and ShareVDE. So if you're creating BIBFRAME data natively in Sinopia, for that data to be able to then populate ShareVDE and then match on the appropriate clusters for Opus, work instance, and the various agents and so forth. So that's a really interesting piece that's sort of rather emergent, and looking forward to seeing some of the results of it.
I also have a comment from Tatiana Pazmenta, who is the lead developer on ShareVDE about the Library of Congress question. And she added to what we have already said that they are working with the Library of Congress for both MARC and in BIBFRAME. They've already integrated the LC MARC data and are now working on their RDF data. So the work is underway on that part of it as well. I see another question from Ingrid about the business model. Her question is ShareVDE going to be a network that is similar to OCLC? Which is a really interesting question. I should say that any library is open to join and become a member of ShareVDE, and there's cost associated with that. But also the data is linked open data. And I think the difference with OCLC, and this is my opinion, is that the database is, because it's linked data, the editing happens in the clustering database and not people grabbing records and pulling them down to the local database. So even though the Penn local skin was shown, the idea is the data remains in the cluster, though we also have access to our own data locally if we choose to use it in various ways. So I think the model is different than OCLC, but I'll let other people comment on that question if they have thoughts.
So I think we should probably wrap up now. We're just about out of time. To be clear, there's a lot of information in this session, so they will be on YouTube later to rewatch. And we can continue this conversation via the conference Slack. So thank you so much to all our panelists today. And I think we can wrap this one up.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.